My parents grabbed my hair while I was speaking at my own graduation party. "You're not the first girl to get a degree." My dad scoffed. My mom called me too proud. They forced me to serve cake. 2 months later, they lost everything and asked to move in. Me, I worked so hard to make it to graduation, and you humiliated me. Why? Dad, you're not the first girl to get a degree, Savannah. Don't be so full of yourself. Mom, you were acting too proud. We had to bring you back down to earth. 2 months later, after losing their home and everything they had, they stood outside my apartment with trash bags full of clothes, asking if they could move in. And now here we are. I grew up in Bedford, Pennsylvania, the kind of town where dreams are considered dangerous. My parents, Arthur and Denise Ward, were Bedford through and through. Small dreams, hard work, simple life. To them, going to college wasn't a sign of ambition, it was a threat. I was the kid who read books at the kitchen table while everyone else watched TV. I was the girl who stayed late at the library while my siblings, Daniel and Harper, hung out at the Dairy Queen. I didn't fit, and my parents never let me forget it. I earned a full scholarship to the University of Pittsburgh. They didn't come to move-in day. They didn't call on my birthday. I worked 2 part-time jobs, lived on ramen and caffeine, and graduated with a degree in biomedical engineering. I was proud, not boastful, just proud. When they said they wanted to throw me a graduation party back home, I thought maybe, finally, they were proud too. I was so stupidly hopeful. The party was nothing fancy. The backyard was half-mowed, the plastic tables wobbled on uneven ground, and the decorations were dollar store banners that said "You did it" in glittery letters. There was a sheet cake misspelling my name, Savannah, and a cooler full of cheap soda. But I smiled. I wanted to believe. When it was time for speeches, I stood up in front of about 30 people, neighbors, distant relatives, a few kids I hadn't seen since middle school. I cleared my throat, clutching my little note card with my speech written out. I thanked my professors, my friends, and finally, my family, even though my parents hadn't really been there. That's when it happened. Arthur, my dad, stomped toward me, his face a dark red. Before I could react, he grabbed a handful of my hair and yanked my head back slightly. I heard gasps ripple through the crowd. "You're not the first girl to get a degree," he barked, loud enough for everyone to hear. I stood frozen. My scalp stung. My chest tightened. Then my mom, Denise, chimed in from across the yard, arms crossed over her chest. "You were acting too proud. Someone had to bring you down a notch." I stared at them, heart pounding, cheeks burning with humiliation. No one did anything. No one said anything. They just watched. And then, as if to cap off the spectacle, my mom shoved the cake blade into my hand and snapped, "Serve everyone." So I did. Silent, mechanical, I sliced the cake that couldn't even spell my name right, and handed out sticky pieces to the same people who pretended nothing had happened. I don't remember much else from that night. I think I blacked out emotionally. I just remember collapsing into my childhood bed, still in my party dress, staring at the cracked ceiling. After that, I didn't call them. I didn't visit. I didn't even text. 2 months later, my phone blew up with missed calls and frantic voicemails. Turns out, Arthur had been cheating the IRS for years, skipping taxes, pocketing cash under the table at his mechanic shop. The government caught up. They seized the shop, froze the accounts, repossessed the truck. Their house, already half falling apart, was foreclosed. In a matter of weeks, my parents were homeless. And somehow, they thought of me, the proud, arrogant daughter who needed to be taken down a peg, as their lifeline. The first voicemail was Denise, fake calm but clearly desperate. "Savannah, honey, it's Mom. We're in a bit of a situation. Could we maybe stay with you? Just for a little while?" I didn't answer. I let 3 days pass. My stomach twisted with guilt, rage, sadness, a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't even name. Finally, I called them back. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply stated the rules: they could stay, but only temporarily. They had to pay for their own food and expenses. They would respect my home and my boundaries. They agreed, of course. Pride goes out the window when you're dragging trash bags full of clothes onto a Greyhound bus. When they arrived at my tiny two-bedroom apartment in Pittsburgh, they looked deflated. Arthur's shoulders hunched in a way I had never seen. Denise's hands shook as she clutched her purse. I showed them the guest room, really just a glorified storage closet I had hastily cleaned out, and gave them fresh sheets. They didn't say thank you. The first few weeks were difficult. Arthur criticized everything. "Why's the rent so high in this dump? You're still single? You better hurry up." Denise fussed nonstop. "This place could use a woman's touch. You should really be saving more money." I bit my tongue. I gritted my teeth. I reminded myself, boundaries. Anytime they crossed a line, I calmly pointed to the door. "If this isn't working for you, you're free to leave." They never did. Pride can only sustain you so far when you've got nowhere else to go. One evening, after Harper visited, mostly to gawk at the situation, I overheard a conversation between my parents in the kitchen. Arthur's voice was low, tired. "We screwed up, Denise. We treated her like crap." Denise, who never cried, broke down in hushed sobs. I stood in the hallway, back pressed to the wall, listening. I didn't move. I didn't comfort them. I just listened. It didn't fix everything. They never gave me a dramatic Hallmark movie apology. They didn't suddenly become perfect parents. But they started trying. In tiny ways. Arthur picked up a part-time job at AutoZone. Denise started volunteering at a food pantry. They bought their own groceries. They even offered to pay for utilities. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Some nights, the old resentment still bubbled up inside me, hot and sharp. Some mornings, I caught Denise giving me the same judgmental look she always had. But something was different. I wasn't that scared little girl anymore. I wasn't seeking their approval like oxygen. I was just Savannah Ward, a woman who fought like miserable for her freedom and now held the power to either perpetuate the cycle, or finally, break it. Living with my parents was like living with ghosts of my own childhood. Every plate clinking in the sink, every heavy sigh from the living room, every shuffled footstep down the hallway, it all echoed with the past. Some days were manageable. I would come home from work, find that Denise had made dinner, simple things like spaghetti or chicken soup, and Arthur would be watching some news channel with the volume too loud. They'd ask about my day, awkwardly, like they were trying to follow some script they had never learned before. Other days were harder. There were mornings when Arthur couldn't resist a jab. "You still working that same job? No promotion yet?" He'd ask, like it was a casual question, not a dagger. Or when Denise would sweep around the kitchen, clucking her tongue at my cluttered countertops. "Living like this isn't very ladylike," she'd mutter, not looking me in the eye. And every time, I'd have to make a choice: engage, react, or let it pass. I usually chose silence. Not because I agreed with them. Not because it didn't hurt. But because arguing with them felt like stepping back into a version of myself I didn't want to be anymore. Instead, I set quiet boundaries. If they criticized too much, I went to my room and shut the door. If they tried to guilt-trip me, I politely excused myself and left the apartment for a walk. If Arthur raised his voice, I calmly reminded him, "You can speak to me with respect, or not at all." Sometimes the tension would simmer for days. Other times, it would boil over in small, stupid ways, like the night Denise reorganized my pantry without asking, and I found myself standing in the kitchen, fists clenched, trying not to scream because, my God, it wasn't about the cereal boxes. It was about every choice they had mocked, every dream they had belittled, every time they made me feel like I was too much for wanting more than Bedford had to offer. And yet, there were moments that made me pause. One Sunday, I came home late after a grueling shift. I was exhausted, head pounding, feet aching. I walked in and found Arthur fixing the broken cabinet under the sink, not because I asked, but because he noticed it was loose. Or the time Denise, usually so prickly, quietly left a new set of notepads and pens on my desk because she knew I was applying for a promotion at work. Tiny gestures. Inconsistent. Unsteady. But real. It would have been easier if they stayed villains in my head. Easier to stay angry, easier to keep the walls up. But life is messy, and people are complicated. Even people who hurt you. Especially people who hurt you. One night, a few months into living together, I found Denise sitting on the couch, staring at an old photo album she must have dug out from one of their trash bags. She looked up when she saw me, eyes glassy. "You always were different," she said quietly, tracing a photo of me at 8 years old, holding up a blue ribbon from a science fair. "We didn't know what to do with you." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to shout, "You didn't have to do anything but love me." Another part of me, the exhausted, slightly older part, just sat down beside her and stayed silent. We flipped through the photos together. We didn't talk much. Just the sound of the pages turning, the occasional soft laugh at a bad haircut or a goofy Halloween costume. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. But it was something. Later, when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't. I wasn't the girl begging for approval anymore. I was the woman choosing, every day, what kind of life I wanted to live and what kind of daughter, if any, I still wanted to be. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. As fall crept into Pittsburgh, the air grew crisp, and the leaves outside my window turned shades of burnt orange and deep red. It was my favorite time of year, the kind that always made me feel like I could start fresh, no matter what had happened before. But the heaviness inside my apartment didn't lift just because the seasons changed. By then, it had been almost 5 months since Arthur and Denise moved in. 5 months of awkward mornings, tense dinners, silent understandings, and broken habits slowly, painfully trying to mend themselves. It was during one of those long Sunday afternoons that something shifted. I was sitting at my little kitchen table, sorting through paperwork for a new job opportunity. A recruiter from a major biotech firm had reached out. It would mean better pay, better benefits, and most importantly, a chance to leave behind the cramped apartment for something bigger. Something mine. Arthur shuffled into the kitchen, mug in hand, and stood there watching me for a moment. "You leaving?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to snap, "Maybe if I get lucky enough to finally get away from you." But I didn't. I had grown out of knee-jerk reactions, at least most days. "I'm considering a new job," I said carefully. "It might mean moving to a new place." Arthur nodded slowly, then sat down across from me, rubbing his hands together like he wasn't sure what to do with them. "You'd be good at it," he said after a beat. "Always were smarter than the rest of us." It was the closest thing to a compliment I had ever gotten from him. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and kept my eyes on the papers. In the following weeks, I started preparing quietly, sending out applications, looking at bigger apartments, not out of cruelty, not because I was trying to abandon them, but because I knew I couldn't keep living trapped in the echoes of my childhood. It wasn't healthy for them, and it certainly wasn't healthy for me. Meanwhile, the subtle improvements in my parents continued, almost like a slow drip wearing down stone. Denise started taking care of their own laundry, no longer asking me for help. Arthur cooked dinner a few times. It was terrible, but edible. They even found a local church community that gave them donated clothes and food staples. They were scraping by. They were surviving. They were adapting. But with every small step they took forward, the pressure on me built heavier. Because I knew the day would come when I would have to tell them I was moving on. Not as punishment. Not out of spite. But because healing sometimes means creating distance, not building bridges. There was one particular evening I'll never forget. A chill in the air, the smell of rain on concrete, the soft rumble of the city settling in for the night. I was sitting on the worn-out couch, laptop open in front of me, scrolling through listings. Denise sat nearby, quietly knitting something, probably a scarf, though she never finished her projects. Arthur was flipping through TV channels, not settling on anything. It felt normal, almost. Like a family. And yet, I couldn't breathe under the weight of it. I closed the laptop and looked around the room, at the mismatched furniture, the tiny kitchen, the sagging curtains. This wasn't supposed to be my life. This wasn't the life I fought for through endless nights of studying and working 2 jobs and eating ramen noodles in a drafty dorm room. I had bigger dreams once. And those dreams were still there, burning quietly, waiting for me to claim them. I sat there a long time that night, feeling like I was balanced on a blade's edge between guilt and freedom. If I left, would I be abandoning them the way they once abandoned me emotionally? Or would I finally be setting both of us free from the version of ourselves that had been stuck for far too long? I didn't know the answer yet. But I knew the question wasn't going away. The conversation I knew I needed to have with them weighed on me like an invisible anchor. At work, I found myself distracted during meetings. I forgot to respond to emails. I missed my subway stop one evening because I was so deep in my thoughts, rehearsing a dozen different versions of how it might go. I'm moving out. I found a new place. You'll have to figure something else out. No matter how I phrased it in my head, it always sounded like betrayal. And yet, wasn't it also betrayal to myself if I stayed? I put it off for weeks, until the night the apartment heater broke. It had been on the fritz for a while, and despite my landlord's promises, no one had come to fix it. So on the first really cold night of October, the apartment felt like an icebox. I was wrapped in a blanket at the kitchen table, trying to concentrate on job paperwork, when I heard my parents arguing quietly in their room. Arthur's voice was low and worn out. "We can't stay here forever, Denise. She's got her own life." Denise's voice cracked with something that sounded suspiciously like fear. "Where are we supposed to go, Arthur? You think anyone else is going to take us in?" There was a long, terrible silence. I sat there, listening, my stomach churning. It hit me harder than anything they had ever said to my face, harder than the hair grab at the party, harder than the years of judgment. They weren't just stubborn, proud people clinging to control anymore. They were scared. And for the first time, I saw them clearly, not as the all-powerful figures of my childhood, but as 2 flawed, scared people who had been broken by their own choices and didn't know how to put themselves back together. It didn't erase the hurt. It didn't erase the past. But it shifted something in me. They needed to move on. And I needed to let myself move on, too. But maybe, just maybe, I could do it in a way that didn't tear the thin thread of peace we had built over these last few months. The next morning, I woke up early. I brewed coffee, set out 3 mugs, and waited. Arthur was the first to shuffle in, hair sticking up on one side, eyes bleary. Denise followed soon after, tightening a sweater around her shoulders. I pushed a mug toward each of them. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. Arthur tensed immediately. Denise's fingers tightened around her mug. "I've been offered a new job," I said. "It's in Shadyside. The pay's better. It comes with a relocation allowance." Neither of them spoke, but the air grew heavy between us. "I'm going to move into a new place in a few weeks," I continued. "A bigger apartment." Still, silence. I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "I'll help you find somewhere to go. Maybe an extended stay hotel for a few months. There are charities that can assist. I can make some calls." Denise opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but then closed it. Arthur stared into his coffee. "I can't be your safety net forever," I said gently. "I love you. But I have to live my own life." Arthur nodded first. Just a small tilt of his head. But it was enough. Denise wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater, trying to pretend she wasn't crying. "We know," she whispered. For a long time, none of us said anything else. The coffee grew cold. The morning sunlight stretched lazily across the scratched-up kitchen counters. Cars honked outside on the busy street. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't clean or easy or pretty. But it was honest. And maybe, for a family like ours, that was the best we could do. Over the next few days, we started making plans. Arthur found a low-income housing program he might qualify for. Denise got information about a local shelter with job placement help. I called around, found a couple of affordable motels offering monthly rates. It was messy. It was uncomfortable. There were nights when Denise slammed cabinet doors a little too hard, when Arthur barely grunted a response to my questions. There were mornings when the tension was so thick I thought I'd choke on it. But we kept moving forward. Slowly. Clumsily. Each step felt like tearing off a bandage that had been stuck too long to old, infected wounds. And deep down, I knew whether they realized it yet or not, this was a second chance for all of us. A chance for them to stand on their own feet. A chance for me to finally stop shrinking myself down just to fit into their small world. Moving day came faster than I expected. The new apartment in Shadyside was bright and spacious, 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, big windows that let in actual sunlight. It was a massive step up from the tiny, cramped place we had all been stuffed into for months. I paid for a cheap moving company to help with the heavy lifting. I rented a U-Haul for the rest. Arthur and Denise packed their things into worn suitcases and black trash bags, just like they had when they first arrived at my door, broken and desperate. Only this time, they weren't following me to a new place. I had reserved them a month's stay at a modest extended stay motel a few miles away, close enough that they could still get around, but far enough that my life could truly be my own. The motel was nothing fancy: beige carpets, faded comforters, a microwave that looked like it might start a fire if you stared at it too hard. But it was a roof. It was safe. It was enough. I handed them the motel keycards in the parking lot, under a sky so blue it almost felt mocking. Arthur took his without a word. Denise clutched hers like it was going to crumble into dust in her hands. "I'll check in on you sometimes," I said. "But you're going to have to manage on your own now." They both nodded. Hollow, small. It wasn't until I drove away that I realized my hands were trembling. Not from sadness. From relief. For the first time in my life, I was no longer tethered to their disappointment. I wasn't shrinking myself down to fit inside their limitations. I was free. The new apartment was everything I had dreamed of and more. The first night I spent there alone, I opened every window. I blasted music. I danced barefoot across the empty living room floor with a glass of cheap wine in my hand, laughing and crying at the same time. This space was mine. Every inch of it was built on my hard work, my sacrifice, my stubborn refusal to give up when everything, even my own family, told me I couldn't make it. And the best part? 2 months later, I got a promotion. My new job saw my potential immediately. They paid for me to attend conferences, to lead projects, to mentor younger engineers. Meanwhile, back at the motel, things were falling apart for Arthur and Denise. Without my steady income to lean on, they struggled. Arthur's part-time job hours were cut. Denise couldn't get stable work because of her health issues, ones she had ignored for years, assuming she'd always have someone else to take care of her. I helped them at first. I dropped off groceries once a week. I sent them information about social programs. I even offered to help them set up a basic budget. But when the motel time ran out and they asked if they could move back in, I said no. I said no with a calm, steady voice they couldn't argue with. I said no without guilt. "I've built a life I'm proud of," I told them. "It's time you build yours, too." Arthur's face twisted with something that looked like anger, but even that burned out quickly into resignation. Denise didn't say anything. She just nodded, eyes downcast. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't petty. It was justice, the kind you earn, slowly, after years of swallowing your pain and still choosing to move forward. They ended up in a small subsidized apartment across town, living off Arthur's meager retirement and whatever Denise could scrap together with part-time work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was sustainable. They learned how to survive without leaning on me like a crutch. And me? I thrived. I decorated my apartment exactly how I wanted. Bright throw pillows. Plants everywhere. A tiny reading nook by the window. I traveled for work New York, Chicago, even one conference in Toronto. I made friends. I started dating again, real dates with men who respected my ambitions instead of feeling threatened by them. I built a life so beautiful it felt like a kind of quiet, patient revenge against every harsh word, every dismissal, every moment they tried to make me feel small. The final, perfect twist of the blade? One evening, about a year later, I hosted a small gathering at my place, coworkers, a few friends, my new boyfriend. Laughter spilled into the hallway, the smell of good food filled the air, and the walls echoed with joy. Somehow, word got back to Arthur and Denise through Harper, who was still in touch with them. They heard about the job, the apartment, the life. And for the first time, they were on the outside looking in. Exactly where they had put me, all those years ago.